They thought they could steal from me. 35 brand new homes, lined up perfectly across land that was never theirs to take. The HOA, fueled by greed and arrogance, built an entire community on property they didn't own. And they believed I was powerless to stop them. But what they didn't know was that beneath the soil ran something far stronger than their contracts or rules, a hidden dam holding back a force they could never control. So when I opened it, everything changed. The question is, would you have done the same? Before everything collapsed into chaos, life on that land was peaceful. For years, it had been my sanctuary. Acres of rolling ground bordered by quiet woods and a stream that whispered at night. I wasn't wealthy, not in the way the HOA board. Members measured wealth, but the land itself had value far beyond money. It carried history, roots, and the simple dignity of ownership. It was mine. And in those early days, that was all that mattered. Neighbors came and went. Some were kind, some indifferent, but they all understood one thing. That stretch of property belonged to me. I tended it, walked it, and respected it. There were no walls, no gates, no lists of arbitrary rules telling me how tall the grass could grow or what color a front door should be. Just land, freedom, and a home I could breathe in. But peace in a neighborhood like mine is never permanent. The HOA, just a few blocks over, had always been expanding. They started small, enforcing petty restrictions on lawns, fences, and even holiday decorations. From a distance, I watched them tighten their grip, turning homes into uniform shells and residents into quiet, compliant faces. It wasn't my problem, or so I thought. At first, their presence felt like background noise, nothing more than the complaints of people who wanted control for control's sake. But whispers began spreading about new projects, community, growth, and modern development. They spoke of progress as if it were inevitable, a shining future that would raise property values for everyone. I didn't care about property values. I cared about peace. Yet slowly signs of intrusion appeared. Surveyors walking too close to the boundary, strange markers planted in the soil, letters with complicated language about zoning adjustments and community integration. Every word felt less like an invitation and more like a warning. The HOA was hungry. Their neighborhood wasn't enough anymore. They wanted more land, more power, more control, and mine was sitting in the perfect spot for their next move. Looking back now, the signs were obvious. But at the time, it was easier to dismiss them as misunderstandings. After all, who would ever think 35 homes could rise overnight on land that wasn't theirs? Who could imagine that an entire board of officials, sworn to protect community interests, would see nothing wrong with erasing the rights of one homeowner to feed their own greed? I had no idea then just how far they were willing to go. I had no idea how fast their expansion would reach my doorstep. And I certainly didn't know that the soil I had walked barefoot on for years would become the battlefield of the biggest fight of my life. All I knew was this: the HOA wasn't done, and their eyes were fixed squarely on my land. The letters kept coming. At first, they were dressed in polite language, stamped with the HOA's seal of authority. Phrases like community benefit, shared responsibility, and future growth coated the page. But beneath the formal words, the message was always the same: surrender your land, or we'll make your life miserable. I ignored the first few notices, tossing them into a drawer, but the HOA doesn't deal in patience. When persuasion fails, they turn to pressure. Soon, inspectors began showing up at my doorstep. They claimed my grass was too long, though it was trimmed neatly. They cited me for a non-compliant fence, though I had never agreed to their jurisdiction. Every week, another envelope. Every week, another fine. The strangest part? These fines weren't even enforceable. My property was never part of their covenant. But they banked on intimidation, hoping I'd fold under the weight of legal jargon and constant harassment. I didn't fold. I documented everything. But the harassment didn't stop with paper. HOA members started walking the perimeter of my land, measuring, taking photos, whispering among themselves like vultures circling. Neighbors who once waved now looked away, afraid of being associated with the one man who dared resist. The isolation was worse than the fines. I wasn't just fighting an organization anymore. I was being erased from the community. And then came the construction. It started with survey stakes in the ground, brightly colored ribbons stabbing through the soil, like wounds. One morning I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. Trucks rolled in, carrying lumber, concrete, and workers with clipboards. I stormed out to stop them, but the foreman shrugged and pointed at his contract. "We've been cleared," he said. "HOA authorization." Authorization? On my land? Day. By day, the skyline shifted. Wooden frames sprouted like weeds. 35 homes, neat and uniform, began to rise where my quiet sanctuary once stretched. The HOA called it progress. I called it theft. They didn't ask. They didn't negotiate. They simply took. And to make matters worse, they mocked me for resisting. The HOA president, a smug man with a polished smile, told anyone who'd listen that I was unstable, a barrier to community development. He painted me as the villain while they played heroes, bringing growth and opportunity to the neighborhood. Inside, I burned. But rage without direction is wasted fuel. So I waited, watched, recorded every nail hammered into stolen soil, every truck that carried stolen dreams. My patience became my weapon. Meanwhile, the HOA kept tightening the noose. They filed bogus liens, hoping to choke me financially. They pressured local officials, greased palms, and twisted regulations until my protests looked like nothing more than the ramblings of a bitter man. My phone calls went unanswered, my complaints buried. Each night, I stood at the edge of my land and watched those houses rise, their lights glowing like intruders in the dark. 35 monuments to arrogance, all standing on the foundation of injustice. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that the land had secrets. Beneath the surface, running silently for years, lay the dam. Built decades ago, it had been my father's safeguard, a way to channel the waters that flowed from the hills each spring. Most forgot it even existed. But I hadn't, and as I watched the HOA celebrate their triumph, parading potential buyers through their new homes, I realized the truth. They had built their empire on sand, and I held the floodgate. The only question was, how long could I wait before I let it flow? The day of reckoning came without warning, at least for them. To the HOA, it was another victory lap, ribbon-cutting day. Neighbors gathered, officials posed for photos, and the board president stood tall, grinning beneath the banner that read, "A new era for our community." To them, it was celebration. To me, it was theater. And I had the final act. I stood at the far edge of my property, near the concealed entrance to the dam's old control system. Rusted, weathered, but still strong, the gate loomed before me, like a coiled beast waiting to be unleashed. My hand trembled as I gripped the lever. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. For every letter, every fine, every humiliation, every stolen inch of soil, this was the answer. And then, I pulled. At first, nothing. Just silence, broken by the sound of laughter in the distance. Then a low groan, like the earth itself waking from a long sleep. The gate creaked, and water began to stir, rushing faster, louder, building into a roar. Within minutes, the stream swelled into a torrent, surging across the ground with unstoppable force. It cut through the soil, swallowing foundations, tearing at the neatly framed houses like they were made of paper. Shrieks pierced the air as the crowd realized what was happening. The HOA president's smile vanished, replaced by panic as the waters consumed the homes he had so proudly unveiled. 35 houses. Gone in hours. The carefully manicured lawns drowned. The pristine sidewalks buckled. The empire they built, on stolen ground, crumbled before their eyes, not with the swing of a hammer, but with the force of nature itself. I didn't cheer. I didn't laugh. I simply watched. Watched as justice, raw and unforgiving, did what I alone could never do. And in that moment, one thought echoed louder than the flood. They had built their world on land that never belonged to them, and the land had taken it back. But this was only the beginning. Because once the waters settled, once the wreckage lay bare for the world to see, the real consequences began. When the floodwaters finally receded, silence hung over the land like a heavy curtain. The laughter, the music, the speeches of ribbon-cutting day, all of it was gone, drowned beneath mud and shattered timber. What remained was wreckage. Twisted, frames of homes that had barely stood a week, sidewalks broken into fragments, lawns turned into rivers of silt. The empire the HOA built had been reduced to nothing more than debris scattered across ground they never had the right to touch. But the real storm had only begun. The next morning, news vans lined the streets. Helicopters hovered overhead, capturing aerial shots of devastation that spread faster than the water itself ever had. Headlines flashed across local and national stations. Flood destroys new HOA development. 35 homes washed away in overnight disaster. Who approved this project? The HOA board tried to spin the story. They claimed the flood was an act of nature, an unforeseeable tragedy. But reporters dug deeper. Paper trails emerged. Contracts, permits, and filings, all riddled with inconsistencies. Some signatures were forged, some approvals rushed. And in every document, one glaring truth. The land they built on wasn't theirs. The cameras turned, not to me, but to them. The same president who had mocked me as a barrier to progress now stood on live television, his polished smile gone, stammering as journalists asked why 35 homes were constructed without legal ownership of the property. He had no answers, only excuses, and each one crumbled under scrutiny. Neighbors who once avoided me now whispered apologies. Strangers who had called me bitter now called me brave. And though no one knew the full truth of what triggered the flood, everyone knew who had set the stage for disaster. The HOA. The lawsuits came next. Families who had invested in those brand new homes filed claims, demanding restitution. Insurance companies refused coverage, citing negligence. Contractors pulled out, distancing themselves from the scandal. And at the center of it all, the HOA found itself drowning. Not in water this time, but in debt, shame, and public outrage. The board dissolved within weeks. Members resigned one by one, fleeing from the wreckage of their reputations. The president, once the face of power, faced criminal charges for fraud, mismanagement, and unlawful development. His fall was swift and merciless, the kind that left no room for sympathy. As for me, I stood on my land, watching the world unravel from the porch I had built with my own hands. For years, I had been silenced, dismissed, cornered. But now, the truth stood in plain sight. The land was mine, and no HOA could ever change that. But victory isn't always clean. I walked the boundaries of my property, boots sinking into wet earth. The dam had done its job, but at a cost. The water left scars, gullies carved deep into the soil, patches of ground eroded beyond recognition. It would take years to restore what was lost, and though I felt no regret, I felt something heavier. The weight of what I had unleashed, the HOA had taken from me, and I had taken everything from them in return. Justice, yes, but also destruction. In the weeks that followed, my land became a symbol. Some called me a hero, the man who stood up against the tyranny of the HOA and won. Others whispered the word monster, suggesting I had gone too far. I let them talk. Because in the quiet moments when the news crews left and the lawsuits dragged on, I asked myself the same question. Was it justice? Or was it revenge? The answer never came easily. What did come were changes. Local officials, shamed by their role in the scandal, tightened regulations. HOAs across the region faced audits. Homeowners who had long suffered under petty rules suddenly found the courage to push back, citing my story as proof that no board, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. A movement began, small at first, but growing. Neighbors standing together, demanding fairness, refusing to be bullied by organizations that had forgotten the meaning of community. I didn't set out to start a revolution. All I wanted was peace on my land. But sometimes, standing your ground sparks something bigger than yourself. Years later, the scars on my property have healed. Grass grows again where the waters tore through. The dam remains, silent now, a reminder of the day. I chose not to be a victim, and every time I walk those acres, I remember both the cost and the reward of defiance. Because here's the truth. Power thrives only when we surrender to it. The HOA believed they could intimidate me, bury me under rules and fines, and erase me with lies. But power built on arrogance is fragile. All it takes is one crack, one act of resistance to bring it down. And when the waters flowed, that crack became a flood. So what's the takeaway? Maybe it's this. Never let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Never let a board, a neighbor, or any self-proclaimed authority strip away what's rightfully yours. Stand your ground, even when it feels impossible, even when you're alone. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or officials. Sometimes it comes from the quiet determination of someone who refuses to back down. The HOA built 35 homes on my land. They thought they had won. But in the end, it wasn't their rules or their contracts that decided the outcome. It was the land itself. It was truth, persistence, and the will to fight back. And as I look out now across fields restored and skies clear, one question lingers, a question I'll leave with you. If they had built 35 homes on your land, would you have opened the dam